Taoiseach, I have to ask if this government believes in climate science, because it's hard to see how you can believe in climate science and then take some of the decisions that you're taking. We had a confirmation yesterday that the extraordinary growth of data centres is continuing. Their consumption of electricity increased by more than 30% last year. So data centres now use up as much electricity as every single household in an urban area, and nearly twice as much as all rural homes. Taoiseach, the amount of electricity demand from data centres was almost entirely matched by the growth in electricity from wind generation in 2022. So in other words, we're running to stand still in decarbonising our energy system. And the government doesn't seem to have any concerns about it. Yesterday, Climate Minister Eamon Ryan criticised the opposition for blaming data centres and vowed to work with them. I can't believe I'd need to explain this to the leader of the Green Party, but it seems necessary. We do not blame data centres for being data centres. We blame the government for not introducing a moratorium on data centres when the Social Democrats first called for one 2 years ago, and for failing to impose conditions on their operations. And Taoiseach, it's not just data centres that are endangering our climate targets. According to the EPA, the government's entire climate action plan is in crisis. In the best case scenario, if every part of the plan were fully implemented, our emissions will decrease by only 29%, not the necessary 51%. How will the government bridge this enormous gap? We have no idea. Do you? Instead of talking about this, you've been much more eager to talk about the EU restoration law, but sadly not in a useful or constructive way, just scaremongering. You said the law would make it more difficult to build wind farms. Wind Europe has described your remarks as fundamentally wrong. You said the law goes too far and would endanger our food security. The opposite is true. Not that we needed any more evidence. More than 60 major companies and industry groups have rejected that, saying our food security depends on protecting and restoring our critically endangered biodiversity. To be fair, I should say that you're not alone in cynically undermining the law. Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin MEPs are doing the same. Taoiseach, I think people out there are genuinely worried about politicians talking out of both sides of their mouth on this issue. It's too important. They want climate action, not a combination of greenwashing and scaremongering. It's not an exaggeration to say that our lives and our livelihoods depend on it. So can I ask, will you impose a moratorium on data centres until you carry out a strategic review? Will you tell us how you intend to bridge the gap in the climate action plan? And will Fine Gael MEPs support the EU nature restoration law?
Deputy Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy. There's a lot of politicians who talk out of both sides of their mouths, and the champions among those are those who come in here and express concern about the housing crisis and then go back to their constituencies and oppose housing. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to that on another occasion, and I will now answer the question. Climate change is real. It's happening. It's a clear and present danger. It's man-made. And we need to act to reverse it. We have to be the generation that turns the tide when it comes to climate change. In relation to data centres, Deputy, there are over 100,000 people in Ireland who work in technology firms. They might not work in the data centres themselves, but their jobs would not exist without the existence of data centres. So they are important to our economy, and they are important in terms of jobs and job creation. While there may not be a moratorium on new data centres, it might be useful for me to advise the Deputy that EirGrid has not approved a new connection since July 2020. That's nearly 2 years since a new data centre has been given a grid connection. And based on the government's policy statement in that regard, applications for new data centres are made on a case-by-case basis, taking into account their impact on things like job creation, for example. In relation to our emissions, Deputy, far from standing still, our electricity-related carbon emissions actually went down last year, not up. So not standing still, going in the right direction, but by no means fast enough. The solution when it comes to data centres is to make sure that A, they're powered through renewable energy, and that's what we're doing, solar, wind, onshore and offshore. And secondly, to make sure that they have their own backup generation, so that in the event that we run into an issue around security of supply, far from being a problem, they can be part of the solution generating electricity and selling it into the grid. And that's our approach to data centres, Deputy. In relation to the EU restoration law, this law is only a proposal at the moment. There are different proposals currently being negotiated. I am absolutely convinced that we can agree an EU restoration law that will help us when it comes to reversing biodiversity loss, but I believe it should be realistic. Targets that are set should be realistic, and we should implement an EU restoration law in a way that doesn't impose compulsory obligations on Irish farmers. It is my very strong view that any rewetting of farmland, of privately owned farmland, should A, be voluntary, and B, should be properly remunerated and compensated by government and the European Union. Will you sign up to that?
Taoiseach, on your comments about there being no new planning applications for data centres, we know that there's a few still in the planning stages and a few still in the construction stages, and they're on course to consume at least 30% of our grid capacity by 2030. And just to give you some context on that, the average in other countries is just 2%. It's clear that you recognise, I think, the value of the growing economy and of not growing it in that way, and I think we all recognise some of the benefits of data centres. But what is also clear, and which was of major concern to many people and to me, is that you don't seem to recognise the cost of not taking climate action and the impact that will have on the economy. It's unimaginable, I think, the impact of it, but as the Taoiseach, it's your responsibility to actually imagine it and act accordingly, and not doing that is unforgivable. In relation to the nature restoration law, it's already been said by the Minister for Agriculture even that there's enough state on Bordamona land, Cuilta land will be used to re-wet the bogs, that farmers will only be asked to do it on a voluntary basis. So there you are with the scaremongering again. So given that all of that information is there, can you assure people that the Fine Gael MEPs will support this very important law? And if not, can you tell us what the plan is in the face of mass biodiversity crisis and rising emissions? What's the plan then?
Thank you, Deputy.
Deputy, I'm not going to engage in scaremongering. I'm just going to give you the basic facts. There are different proposals being negotiated at the moment in relation to the EU restoration law. There's a proposal at the Parliament, which is very radical. There's a proposal at the European Council, which the government is currently negotiating on, and there's also a proposal made by the Commission. At a certain point, we get to trialogue, and we try to come to an agreement between those three different bodies. And the position of the government is very clear. We support an EU nature restoration law. We think it's a good idea. It's about a lot more than rewetting. It's about urban areas as well, and increased biodiversity in urban and suburban areas. But we're also very clear on this, that we do not support imposing on Irish farmers rewetting obligations that are compulsory, and anything that is done has to be properly remunerated. And I'd like to see people from rural constituencies like Court South West, like Wicklow, for example, backing the government in that regard, because I don't see how farmers in Cork South West or Wicklow or other rural constituencies could possibly believe that the Social Democrats have their backs.